It's a war that lives in the shadow of giants. It has no Lincoln, no Churchill, no defining battle like Waterloo or Gettysburg. It's a conflict that ended in a draw, where both sides claimed victory, and whose peace treaty ignored the very reasons the fighting started. It's the war where the United States Capitol and White House were burned to the ground, yet it's the war Americans barely remember. This is the story of the War of 1812, a strange, messy, and absolutely crucial conflict. It was a war that could have destroyed the young American Republic before it had a chance to grow, but instead, it forged a nation. This is the story of America's forgotten war and why it's so important to understand. To understand why the United States, a fledgling nation with a tiny military, would declare war on the British Empire, the superpower of the age, you have to understand the world of the early 19th century. Britain was locked in a titanic struggle with Napoleon's France. This global conflict was the engine driving everything, and the young United States was caught right in the middle. The primary cause of the war can be summed up in one word: impressment. The British Royal Navy was a behemoth, but it was chronically short on sailors. To man its fleet, it resorted to the brutal practice of impressment, essentially legalized kidnapping. British press gangs would board American merchant ships on the high seas and forcibly conscript sailors into service. They claimed they were only taking British deserters, but thousands of American citizens were illegally captured and forced to fight for the crown. For Americans, this was a humiliating violation of their sovereignty, a constant reminder that Britain still saw them as a rogue colony, not an equal. Then, there were the trade restrictions. To strangle Napoleon's economy, Britain imposed a sweeping naval blockade of Europe. American merchants, trying to remain neutral and trade with both sides, found their ships seized and their cargo confiscated. The U.S. saw this as economic warfare. President Thomas Jefferson's attempt to fight back with a trade embargo was a catastrophic failure, crippling the American economy far more than it hurt Britain. But the grievances weren't just at sea. On the western frontier, what was then Ohio, Indiana, and Michigan, a different conflict was brewing. American settlers were pushing relentlessly west, hungry for land. This land, however, belonged to a powerful confederacy of Native American nations, led by the visionary Shawnee chief Tecumseh and his brother Tenskwatawa, known as the Prophet. Tecumseh argued that no single tribe could sell land that belonged to all native peoples. He traveled across the continent, uniting tribes into a formidable alliance to resist American expansion. And who was supplying this alliance? The British in Canada. From their forts, they provided weapons and support to Tecumseh's confederacy, seeing it as a crucial buffer state to protect Canada and contain American growth. For the American warhawks in Congress, men like Henry Clay, this was an act of aggression. They saw a chance to solve two problems at once: crush native resistance and, while they were at it, conquer Canada, expelling the British from the continent for good. This blend of defending national honor, ending economic frustration, and fulfilling territorial ambition finally pushed the United States to the breaking point. In June of 1812, President James Madison asked Congress for a declaration of war, and the forgotten war began. The American war plan seemed simple: invade and conquer Canada. Former President Thomas Jefferson famously declared that capturing Canada would be a mere matter of marching. He was profoundly wrong. The American invasion of Canada was a complete disaster, a series of embarrassing blunders from poor leadership and untrained troops. The 1812 invasion failed spectacularly. At Detroit, General William Hull, terrified of Tecumseh's warriors and tricked by a brilliant British bluff, surrendered his entire army without firing a shot. Other campaigns fizzled out as American militia simply refused to cross the border into Canada, citing their constitutional right not to fight on foreign soil. While the land war was a fiasco, a different story unfolded on the high seas. The tiny U.S. Navy, with only about 16 warships, scored a series of stunning victories in single-ship duels. Ships like the USS Constitution became legends. In a famous battle, the Constitution's thick oak hull seemed to repel British cannonballs, earning it the immortal nickname Old Ironsides. These victories were a massive morale boost, but they were strategically a drop in the ocean. The Royal Navy quickly adapted, and by 1813 it established a crushing blockade along the entire American coast, strangling the U.S. economy. The war's most critical theater became the Great Lakes, as controlling these inland seas was the key to the entire western frontier. In 1813, a young American naval commander named Oliver Hazard Perry was tasked with building a fleet from scratch on the shores of Lake Erie. In a desperate, bloody battle, Perry's fleet defeated the British squadron. He scribbled one of the most famous dispatches in military history: "We have met the enemy, and they are ours." This victory was a game-changer. It forced the British and their ally Tecumseh to abandon Detroit and retreat into Canada. At the ensuing Battle of the Thames, American forces caught up with them. In the fighting, the great chief Tecumseh was killed, and with his death, his dream of a unified Native American confederacy was shattered. It was a devastating blow to native resistance and a major turning point in the war. By 1814, the global situation had changed. Napoleon had been defeated in Europe, allowing Britain to turn its full, undivided attention to America. Seasoned veterans from the Napoleonic Wars were shipped across the Atlantic, and the British planned a series of major offensives to knock the U.S. out of the war for good. Their most audacious target was the American capital. In August 1814, a British force landed in Maryland and marched on Washington, D.C. At the Battle of Bladensburg, they met a hastily assembled force of American militia who broke and fled in a panic. The road to Washington was wide open. What followed was a profound national humiliation. British troops marched into the city and set fire to its most important public buildings. The Capitol was gutted, the Library of Congress destroyed, and the President's mansion, the future White House, was left a charred shell. President Madison and his government had already fled. It was an act of retaliation for American looting of York, modern-day Toronto, earlier in the war, and it was designed to shatter American morale. From Washington, the British moved on to their next target, the crucial port city of Baltimore. But Baltimore was ready, defended by the formidable Fort McHenry. For 25 straight hours, British warships bombarded the fort with a relentless barrage of rockets and cannonballs. A young American lawyer named Francis Scott Key, detained on a British ship, watched the bombardment through the night. When dawn broke on September 14th, he saw through the smoke that the fort's massive American flag was still flying defiantly. The British attack had failed. Inspired, Key began to write a poem he called The Defense of Fort McHenry. We know it today as the Star-Spangled Banner. While Washington burned, diplomats from both sides were meeting in Ghent, Belgium. The war had become a costly stalemate. Britain, exhausted from decades of fighting Napoleon, had no appetite for a prolonged war of conquest in America. The U.S., with its economy in ruins and capital burned, knew it could not win an outright victory. On Christmas Eve of 1814, they signed the Treaty of Ghent. The treaty was remarkable for what it didn't say. It made no mention of impressment or trade rights. It simply restored the borders to what they were before the war began, a principle known as status quo ante bellum. On paper, the war had changed nothing. It was officially a draw. But news traveled slowly in the 19th century. 2 weeks after the peace treaty was signed, but before word had reached America, the final and most famous battle of the war took place. A massive British force of veterans attacked New Orleans, hoping to seize control of the Mississippi River. Defending the city was a motley American army of regulars, militia, pirates, and free men of color, all under the command of a tough general named Andrew Jackson. From behind their makeshift defenses of mud and cotton bales, Jackson's men unleashed a devastating fire on the advancing British. The result was a stunningly one-sided American victory. The British suffered over 2,000 casualties, the Americans fewer than 100. The Battle of New Orleans was a military masterpiece, and it turned Andrew Jackson into a national hero. The Battle of New Orleans had no effect on the war's outcome, but it had a profound effect on how Americans remembered it. News of Jackson's incredible victory reached the public at the same time as news of the peace treaty. The sequence of events created the powerful illusion that America had won the war. The disastrous invasions of Canada were forgotten, the burning of Washington downplayed, and the war was framed as a glorious Second War of American independence. And in a way it was. The War of 1812 may have ended in a draw, but its consequences were immense. For the United States, it ignited a powerful wave of nationalism. The country had taken on a superpower and survived, creating a new sense of self-confidence that fueled westward expansion. For Canada, the war was a defining moment. French and English-speaking Canadians had united to repel the American invaders, forging a shared identity that put them firmly on the path to nationhood, separate from the United States. But for the Native American nations, the war was an unmitigated tragedy. They had fought to preserve their lands, but with the death of Tecumseh and the collapse of their British alliance, they were left to face the relentless tide of American expansion alone. The war broke the back of native resistance east of the Mississippi. The War of 1812 is a paradox. It's the war that changed nothing, and yet changed everything. It secured America's independence, defined Canada's future, and sealed the fate of native nations. It's a messy, complicated story, which is perhaps why it's so often forgotten. But in its blunders and its victories, we see the chaotic and painful birth of the modern American nation. History is never as simple as a win or a loss. The War of 1812 proves that a draw can be more transformative than a decisive victory.